Today I'm going to show you how to make a memo board using a circular knitting machine and an I-cord maker. This is a very simple project and it's a fun way to display photographs and letters. If you enjoy this project, you might also like my knitting machine pattern books, which are available on Amazon. You can find Circular Knitting Machine Patterns Volume 1, 2, 3, and 4 linked below in the description. You can find all of my digital patterns available in my Etsy shop, also linked below. And you can keep up with all my knitting machine projects on Instagram by joining me at Diana Levine Knits. Here are the supplies I used to make this project. The Addi Express Kingsize knitting machine, weight 4 medium yarn. The yarn shown here is Loops and Threads Impeccable yarn in the colors Sea Green and Classic Gray, and I used 2 skeins of the Sea Green and 1 in the Classic Gray. A 4-needle I-cord maker such as the Tulip I-cord knitter, a piece of cardboard at least 16 by 16 inches, or several sheets of mat board in the same size. For the project shown here, I used 3 sheets of 16 by 20 inch 4-ply mat board for picture framing, but any sturdy cardboard will work. You'll also need a crochet hook, a darning needle, a pair of scissors, and some packing tape. You can also make this project with a 48 needle circular knitting machine. However, the pieces will be slightly wider, so the knitting will wrap around the cardboard a little differently than shown here. The techniques you'll need to complete this project include casting on and off of a knitting machine using scrap yarn, seaming the ends of a knitting machine piece, and using the mattress stitch. In terms of sizing, this project measures approximately 16.5 by 16.5 inches. I'm going to go through the instructions a little quicker than usual today, so if you need more detail in terms of how to use the knitting machine and the techniques I'm using here, you can watch some of my previous videos on my channel where I show every step from casting on to casting off. And if you find these videos helpful, please subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with my latest tutorials. Step 1 is to knit the pieces. Cast onto a 46 or 48 needle circular knitting machine using scrap yarn. Knit 5 rows in the scrap yarn. Switch to the main color yarn, leaving a very long yarn tail in the main color. Using medium tension, knit 100 rows in the main color. Then switch back to the scrap yarn, again leaving a very long yarn tail in the main color. Knit 5 rows in the scrap yarn. Then cut the yarn and continue knitting until the work falls off the needles. Repeat this process 2 more times to create 3 pieces in the same length. Each piece has 100 rows in the main color with 5 rows of scrap yarn at the beginning and end. Step 2 is seaming the ends. Use a crochet hook to seam the open ends of the work closed. If you need help with this step, please see some of my earlier videos for further instructions. Remove the scrap yarn. Repeat this process to seam the open ends of all 3 pieces. You'll now have 3 pieces, 100 rows each, which are seamed and ready to assemble. Step 3 is seaming the pieces together. Next, use the mattress stitch to seam the pieces together. It's important for this project to have a clean seam because the seams will show on the front of the memo board. To make a clean seam, make sure to follow along the same line of stitches from beginning to end. Thread one of the long yarn tails onto a darning needle. Before seaming, look at the 2 pieces and identify 2 lines of V-shaped stitches running in the same direction that you'd like to bring together using the mattress stitch. When you work the seam, thread through the interior bars to the interior sides of these lines. Begin by threading through 2 interior bars on one piece. Pull the yarn through. Then thread through 2 interior bars on the other piece. Pull the yarn through. Continue back and forth between these steps. Soon you'll see a seamless join beginning to form between the 2 pieces. Continue seaming, making sure to follow along the same line of stitches from beginning to end until you reach the other end. When you reach the end, secure the yarn with a couple of good knots. The first 2 pieces are now seamed together. Next, repeat the same process to seam the 3rd piece to the 2nd piece. The seaming is now complete and you'll have a piece that's approximately square. The knitting shown here measures approximately 19.5 inches by 19.5 inches. If your piece is a little smaller or larger, that's okay, as long as it's a few inches wider and taller than your cardboard piece. Step 4 is cutting the cardboard. After you've finished measuring your knitting, identify what size square you'd like to cut for the support for your memo board. For the project shown here, I'm using a piece of 16 by 20 inch 4-ply mat board made for picture framing. Measure out a square in your preferred size and cut out the square. The square shown here measures 16 inches by 16 inches. If you're using a thinner cardboard, as shown here, you can cut out a few pieces in the same size and then tape them together using packing tape to create a stronger support. Step 5 is seaming the knitting around the support. Place the knitting with the inside of the work facing up. The inside is whichever side you want to be hidden, and the outside is whichever side you want showing as the front of your board. Place the square cardboard piece over the knitting. Fold 2 of the sides of the knitting over the support. You want to give the pieces a bit of a pull when you do this, so that the knitting fits tightly to the support. You don't want to pull it so tightly that it stretches out the stitches too much, but you want the tension enough that the knitting lays flat on the front of the memo board. Then seam those sides down. Cut a new length of yarn in the main color and secure it with a knot on the side of the knitting. Then use your preferred seaming method to seam that piece down. For the pieces shown here, I used the mattress stitch. However, this seam will not show from the front, so you can use whatever seaming method you find easiest. Repeat this process on all 4 corners. All 4 corners shown here are now seamed down. Next, fold the other 2 sides around the support, again giving them a stretch while you pull them around. Flip the piece around while you're placing the knitting to make sure you like the look of the front. Then seam those corners down to the knitting on the back. You can use whatever seaming method you prefer. For the seams shown here, thread through 1 V-shaped stitch on one side and pull the yarn through. Then thread through 1 V-shaped stitch on the other piece and pull the yarn through. Continue back and forth, pulling tightly while you work until the piece is seamed down. Then secure the yarn with a knot. Leave all the yarn tails free for now because you'll be using them later. Repeat this process on all 4 corners of the work. All 4 corners are now seamed down. Step 6 is pulling the sides together in the back. The piece of knitting will be wrapped around the cardboard support now, but to make sure the knitting looks tightly pulled across, thread one of the long yarn tails from the back onto a darning needle and thread through a couple of stitches across on the other side. Pull the yarn firmly while you work. Go back and forth between a couple of stitches on one side with a couple of stitches on the other side, all the way along the back of the knitting. These 2 sides are now pulled together. Next, repeat the same process in the other direction, pulling together the top and bottom sides. You can use several different yarn tails for this process, or you can simply cut a very long length of yarn in the main color. After the pieces are pulled together, check the front of the work to make sure the knitting looks how you'd like it to look. Then turn the piece back over. Trim all the yarn tails and weave them into the center layer of the work. The memo board is now seamed and assembled. Step 7 is adding the I-cords. This project uses I-cords for the front of the board. If you don't have an I-cord maker, you can hand knit or crochet the I-cords instead. For this project, I'm using the Tulip I-cord knitter. To begin, knit 2 I-cords that are long enough to wrap around the board diagonally with some extra for tying the knot. The 2 I-cords shown here measure approximately 52 inches. Place the first I-cord diagonally across the front of the board. Make sure to untwist the I-cord so the stitches aren't twisted. Then wrap the I-cord around to the back and flip the work over. Pull the I-cords tightly and tie the 2 ends together tightly with a double knot. It's important for this project to pull the I-cord tightly so that it sits close to the board, which will help keep the photos in place. Then turn the work back to the front and place the second I-cord diagonally in the opposite direction. Like earlier, make sure the I-cord isn't twisted and pull the I-cord tightly while securing the double knot. You'll now have 2 I-cords secured in place in the shape of an X. Next, knit 4 more I-cords. These can be shorter than the first 2. The I-cords shown here measure approximately 36 inches. You can leave the bind-off stitches live so that you can pull out the stitches if you end up needing them to be shorter. Place the board face up and lay one of the I-cords in the position shown here, from the center of one side to the center of the next side. Again, flip the board over and make sure the I-cord isn't twisted and pull tightly while you tie the ends together in a double knot. If your cast-off stitches are still live, pull out any extra rows and then secure the end of the I-cord with a knot and weave in the yarn tails. While you're placing these 4 I-cords, it's okay if they don't stay perfectly still in the right spot. They should have the right tension for where you'd like them to be placed, with the I-cords being stretched tightly, but you'll secure them in place later in the project. Repeat the same process again 3 more times with the remaining 3 I-cords to create the memo board pattern. Next, you may notice that the area where the I-cords should be connected to the sides are pulling apart. To bring them together, cut a new length of yarn in the same color as the I-cords, and use a darning needle to thread the yarn through both pieces. Pull as tightly as you can while securing the yarn with a couple of good knots. This will bring the 2 pieces together. After you've secured the 2 I-cords together, thread through a couple of stitches on the memo board as well, and secure with a knot which will help keep the I-cords in place. The I-cords will now look like they're joined as shown here. Repeat this process on the remaining 3 sides. You'll see here that all 4 sides are now joined together. Weave in all remaining yarn tails. Next, cut a new length of yarn in the same color as the I-cord and secure the corner I-cords in place to the knitting by threading through a couple of stitches in the knitting close to the back side and through the I-cord at the corner, and tie the yarn tails together tightly with a few good knots. Weave in the yarn tails. Repeat this process on the remaining 3 corners, which will help keep the I-cords in place. The last step is to knit 5 small I-cords and bind off the stitches at about 1 inch long. Place the small I-cord over where 2 of the I-cords meet to form an X shape. Thread 1 long yarn tail from right to left through a couple of stitches on the memo board, and then thread the other yarn tail back through the same stitches going the other way. Bring the yarn tails down, and then tie the yarn tails together tightly with a couple of good knots. Then weave in the yarn tails into the center layer of the work. Repeat this process for all 5 X-shaped joins. Or if you prefer, you can use buttons over these areas instead. If you'd like, add a knitting tag to the side of the memo board. Next, you can add photos, cards, or letters under the I-cords. Your knitting machine memo board is now complete. To display the board, use a wall hook such as the hook shown here, which lays flat to the wall. You can use the yarn lengths that are running horizontally across the back of the memo board to place onto the hook, or you can simply prop the board up against a wall as shown here. If you make this project, please tag me on Instagram at DinahLevine so I can see your work. And if you enjoyed this project, please check out my knitting machine pattern books, Circular Knitting Machine Patterns Volume 1, 2, 3, and 4, all available now on Amazon. And you can find all my patterns as individual downloads in my shop, also linked below. Thanks for watching.